Hello, dear listener. I am grateful you are here with me today. Please subscribe so you can stay close for the next story and tell me in the comments which city or country you are listening from. It always touches my heart to see how far these moments reach. Enjoy the listen. The night was quiet in the small wooden cabin where a little girl lay awake listening to the wind move through the trees around her, and though she did not yet know her destiny, the world already whispered to her. The world already called her name long before she would choose it herself, and long before she would stand on stages and speak words that would echo through centuries and stir the souls of millions. Her name would one day become Sojourner Truth, but she was born Isabella, a child who came into a world that did not see her as a child at all, a world that stripped names from families and tore memories out by their roots, a world that held chains tighter than love ever had a chance to hold. And though she was small, her spirit was already forming like iron heated deep within a furnace, pressed by the weight of injustice, yet refusing to break, refusing to melt, refusing to disappear. She remembered her mother's hands, warm, strong, worn by labor, yet gentle, as they brushed her hair and sang prayers in a language lost to time and stolen lands, a language Isabella did not fully understand, yet always felt in her bones, a language that told her she was more than property, more than survival, more than what the world said she was meant to be. Her father spoke less, but his silence carried storms, his posture carried generations, his eyes held centuries of stories that had been forced, silent stories he could never tell, but stories Isabella could somehow still hear inside her heart. But childhood was short and cruel under the shadow of slavery, and before the sun of her life had risen, she was sold like an object, sold away from those hands that had held her safe, sold into a life that carved strength into her, because softness was not allowed and weakness was not permitted. She still remembered standing on the wooden block, the cold air brushing her skin as strangers studied her body as if she were livestock, eyes weighing her value, not her humanity, voices discussing her price, not her dreams, and at that moment a quiet fire began. Inside her, a small spark born of pain, born of loss, born of a truth she did not yet have words for. And though she had no voice, the world was already building one inside her, shaping one inside her, forging one that one day would cut through the silence like a blade through darkness. Her new owner was harsh, his wife harsher, and Isabella felt the sting of the whip more times than she could count, sometimes for reasons she understood, sometimes for reasons she would never know, and every hit carved something in her, something deep and invisible, something the world would later recognize as unshakable courage. She learned quickly that the world she lived in did not care if she cried, did not care if she hurt, did not care if she bled, and so she learned not to cry. She learned to swallow pain like stone. She learned to carry heartbreak like breath inside her chest, and she learned that survival was not an instinct for her, it was a destiny. But even in suffering, she watched the sky every night through cracks in the broken roof and whispered prayers into the darkness, prayers her mother had taught her, prayers that asked for freedom, prayers that asked for strength, prayers that asked for a future she was not sure she would ever live to see. She grew into a young woman with a back strong enough to lift burdens twice her size and a voice quiet but steady, a voice waiting for its moment. And though she could not read, though she could not write, she understood the world through feeling and instinct. She understood cruelty like a language spoken fluently in every corner of her life. But she also understood hope like a stubborn flame that refused to die. One day, when she was older, she looked at the horizon and felt something shifting inside her, like the ground beneath her feet was moving, like destiny was calling her forward, urging her to step into something greater than pain, greater than fear, greater than every chain that had ever held her captive. She did not know that her name would change, or that her purpose would bloom, or that her voice, once silent, would rise to shake the foundations of oppression itself. She only knew one thing. She was not meant to live and die in bondage. That quiet truth lived inside her like breath, like heartbeat, like prophecy. And soon the world would hear it too. The morning air was gray with mist when Isabella felt something shift inside her, a pull like an invisible hand guiding her step by step toward a road she had never walked before, a road that had waited years for her feet to touch it, and though she did not yet call it freedom, something in her spirit recognized the way it whispered to her. Her hands were cracked from labor, her back ached from endless days bent beneath the weight of a world built on her suffering, yet her heart still beat with a stubborn fire that refused to go silent and refused to surrender. And as she stood before the fields she had worked For so long she realized she could no longer carry the life that had been forced upon her. She had given enough of her body, enough of her youth, enough of her tears, and she could not give any more. So on that quiet morning when the sun hid behind a veil of clouds, Isabella did something that many believed impossible. She walked away, not with fear pushing her, but with destiny pulling her forward, each step heavy with the knowledge that she could be punished or captured or killed, yet each step filled with a strange peaceful courage telling her, keep going, do not turn back. The world behind her cracked like old wood as she left it, and the air around her felt lighter, as though the sky itself recognized her choice and blessed it, and with nothing but faith guiding her, she walked toward a new life, leaving behind a name that held too much sorrow and too many scars. She walked until her legs trembled, until her breath grew thin, until her heart pounded like a drum of war inside her chest. But even then she did not stop, because something deeper than strength was carrying her, something older than time itself, something born in every soul that refuses to live in chains. Hours passed, then days, and she found shelter at the home of a kind family, the Van Wagenens, whose door opened not with suspicion, but with mercy, and Isabella tasted something she had never known before, the feeling of being treated like a human being, not property, not burden, but human. It was strange and warm and frightening all at once. They listened to her story, and they did not look away. They heard her pain and did not silence her. They saw the wounds carved into her and did not turn her into a shadow, and for the first time since childhood, Isabella felt her spirit exhale a breath it had been holding for years. She worked for them with devotion, grateful for every moment of peace, every moment of dignity, and it was there in that modest home she discovered something that would anchor her entire life: faith, not the kind spoken by those who use scripture to justify cruelty, but the kind that spoke directly to her soul, telling her she was seen, she was loved, she was carried by a strength greater than any pain she had endured. And one night, as she lay beneath a simple quilt, the moonlight glowing faint across her face, she felt something whisper to her, something tender yet powerful, a calling that wrapped itself around her name and lifted it up, transforming it into something new, something bold, something that declared everything she had survived. She felt her old name fall away like broken chains. Isabella was a chapter closed, a story of bondage ended. In its place rose a new name, a name she said aloud in a trembling whisper, yet filled with a fire that could set mountains trembling. Sojourner Truth. A traveler of purpose, a bearer of truth, a voice rising from silence, a soul awakened to its mission. That night, she felt her past settle behind her like dust, and her future open like a vast horizon she had waited her whole life to reach. She did not know where the road would take her, but she knew it would not end in quiet. She knew her voice was meant to rise loud and strong. She knew she was meant to speak for those who could not speak for themselves. And so the next morning, with her new name warming her chest like the first sunrise after a long winter, she stepped into the world again, not as a woman escaping something, but as a woman walking towards something, a woman whose truth would soon echo in churches and meeting halls, in streets, and in hearts across the nation. The journey had begun. A journey that would shake the foundations of injustice. A journey that would make America tremble and listen. A journey that would turn one woman into a force history could not contain. The road was long and winding beneath her feet as Sojourner Truth stepped into her destiny, a path that did not promise comfort, did not promise safety, yet called to her with an unshakable certainty that her voice was no longer hers alone, her life no longer hers alone, her purpose no longer a whisper but a rising wave. She traveled from town to town with nothing but the clothes on her back and the fire in her spirit, her footsteps guided by faith deeper than fear, stronger than memory, and everywhere she went she carried stories not written in books, but carved into her bones, stories of mothers separated from children, of men broken by chains, of women whose silent cries filled her nights with echoes she could never forget. She did not speak for herself. She spoke for all of them. At first people looked at her with suspicion, some with curiosity, some with judgment, but when she opened her mouth something extraordinary happened. Her words did not simply speak, they moved, they pressed into people, they stirred hearts that had long grown cold and minds that had long grown stubborn. Her voice was unlike anything they had ever heard, warm yet fierce, steady yet trembling, with power sharp enough to cut through lies, soft enough to reach the most wounded parts of a listener's soul. She spoke in small kitchens and crowded barns, in candlelit churches, and in open fields wherever someone would stop long enough to listen, and soon whispers began to move ahead of her like wind sweeping across the land. Have you heard her? There is a woman traveling who speaks truth like thunder, who survived chains yet speaks with grace, who carries the weight of a nation in her voice, and makes strangers feel the heaviness too. Sojourner felt the momentum, but she never claimed credit. She always said the words were given to her, the strength was given to her. She was only the vessel, only the messenger, walking where she was called to walk, standing where she was told to stand. But every new place carried challenges, every new crowd carried hostility. Some could not accept a black woman speaking with authority, some could not accept a former enslaved woman confronting their beliefs with unshakable calm, and many tried to silence her. They shouted at her, tried to drown her voice with anger, tried to make her sit, tried to make her leave. But Sojourner Truth was not a woman who bowed to storms. She had already survived the greatest storms a human heart could bear. She had already endured a lifetime of breaking and rebuilding, and no earthly voice, no matter how loud, could ever undo her courage. One night, as she prepared to speak in a crowded hall, a group of men muttered from the back, voices thick with mockery, daring her to prove she was a woman, as though her power somehow threatened their understanding of the world, and the crowd waited breathless, unsure how she would respond. Sojourner stepped forward slowly, her posture tall, her eyes unwavering, her presence commanding the entire room with nothing more than quiet strength, and in the silence, she unbuttoned the top of her dress, just enough to reveal the scarred dark skin beneath, a body shaped by bondage, a truth carved by hands that had tried to break her. And in that moment the room fell silent. No one questioned her womanhood again. Her journey continued city after city, and her message grew sharper. She began speaking not only for enslaved people, but for women as well, demanding the world see them not as ornaments, not as property, not as shadows, but as equals, deserving voice and dignity and freedom. Some audiences cheered, others trembled, others resisted. But no one forgot her. And yet, despite the rising fame, despite the recognition, she remained humble, walking miles to reach distant towns, sleeping wherever a kind stranger offered her shelter, trusting that the road would always provide what she needed. Her ministry of truth was not a performance. It was survival turned into purpose. Pain turned into prophecy. But there was something else rising ahead of her, a stage larger than any she had ever stood on, a moment that would define her legacy, a gathering of leaders and activists and thinkers who were shaping the future of women's rights, and though she did not know it yet, the world was about to hear one of the most powerful speeches ever spoken by a single voice. A voice that carried history. A voice that carried fire. A voice that would echo far beyond the walls where it was born. And the road was guiding her there. Step by step, word by word, truth by truth. The sun was setting over Ohio when Sojourner Truth arrived at the convention hall, a simple building crowded with voices and footsteps and the restless stirring of people who had traveled from distant towns to witness a gathering they believed could change the world. Women from different places stood together for the first time, calling for equality, calling for dignity, calling for a future where their daughters would no longer grow up in silence. Sojourner entered quietly, her tall figure wrapped in a worn shawl, her eyes steady, her presence calm but powerful, and though many in the room did not know her, they felt something shift when she stepped inside, as if a new force had arrived, something ancient, something fierce, something impossibly gentle and impossibly strong all at once. Speakers took the stage one by one, some delivering polished speeches, some offering thoughtful arguments, some trembling as they tried to speak their truth while facing a world that had never cared for their voices, and though their words were meaningful, the room carried tension heavy enough to bend the air around them. There were men in the audience too, some supportive, some waiting with hostility, ready to challenge, ready to dismiss. And as the debates grew sharper and louder, the conversation drifted toward a painful idea, the belief that women were too delicate, too weak, too emotional to stand equal beside men. The moment the words were spoken, the room rippled with unease, whispers rising like cold wind around the edges of the hall. The argument felt familiar. It was the same argument used to deny women their rights, the same argument used to deny enslaved people their humanity, the same argument used to keep entire generations silent. Sojourner had heard those words her entire life, and inside her heart something deep and fierce began to rise. She did not plan to speak. She had not asked for the stage. But truth was calling her forward just as it always had. A few people murmured her name quietly, urging her to take the floor, and after a long breath, she stepped into the center of the room, the wooden boards creaking beneath her feet, the crowd slowly falling silent as they waited for her to begin. She looked at their faces, at their uncertainty, at their fear and hope intertwined, and when she opened her mouth, her voice flowed through the hall, warm and steady, carrying the strength of centuries. Well, children, where there is so much racket, there must be something out of kilter. Her words floated through the air, and the room froze, suspended in a stunned quiet, because no one expected her to speak with such calm authority, with such certainty, with such gentle power. She continued speaking slowly, letting each word settle into the bones of every listener, and though her tone was soft, it carried the force of truth that could not be denied. Look at me, I have plowed and planted and gathered into barns, and no man could head me. Her voice rose not in anger, but in affirmation, each sentence sweeping across the hall like a wave that washed away every excuse, every lie, every belief that women were weak. And as she spoke, her arms lifted, revealing muscles shaped by labor, strength carved by survival, a body hardened by a lifetime of carrying burdens no delicate woman could have withstood. Ain't I a woman? The words cut through the air like lightning. They shook the walls. They shattered the silence. They held the entire room captive. Ain't I a woman? She repeated it again, letting the phrase echo, letting the truth sink deeper into the hearts of everyone present, reminding them that womanhood was not one shape, not one softness, not one story. Her voice grew stronger as she spoke of 13 children she had borne and seen sold into the darkness, her cries heard only by God when no one else would listen, and her voice trembled not from weakness, but from the unbearable weight of memory. When she asked again, "Ain't I a woman?" the room trembled. And then she spoke of intellect, of truth, of faith, reminding them that strength did not erase femininity, and suffering did not erase womanhood, and courage did not negate tenderness. She ended with a quiet power that filled the room like rising dawn, leaving not a single heart untouched, not a single belief unshaken. And when she finished, the silence was vast and heavy and sacred until the crowd erupted not with noise, but with something deeper, respect, awe, a collective recognition that they had witnessed history forming right in front of them. That day her speech was not written down. That day her voice alone carried the message. That day truth itself stood before them in the shape of a woman who had risen from chains to change the world. And nothing after that moment would be the same. Long after her words faded into the rafters of that crowded Ohio hall, Sojourner Truth felt the world shifting beneath her feet like soil turning before a new harvest. She had spoken from the deepest place in her soul, and the echo of her voice traveled farther than she could have imagined, carried by those who heard her, carried by those who repeated her truth in distant towns, carried by those whose hearts had been awakened by the power of her story. But Sojourner did not rest. She had never lived a life of rest, and she did not know how to stop moving. She understood that a single speech was not a victory, it was only a spark, a beginning, a stirring of something that needed nurturing and protection. So she kept traveling down long dirt roads, across cold wooden bridges, through quiet forests and bustling streets, speaking wherever she felt she was called. Sometimes she spoke to large crowds, sometimes to only a few people sitting around a fire, sometimes to a single stranger who needed to hear her voice more than they needed anything else. The size of the crowd never mattered, because every soul she reached was another lantern lit in a world still shrouded in darkness. She visited towns where people welcomed her with open arms, and she visited towns where hostility burned in the air. The moment she arrived, she saw faces twist with anger. When she stood before them, a black woman unapologetically demanding justice, she heard whispers filled with fear and hatred, and yet she walked into every room with the same calm certainty, because she carried something those voices could never extinguish: purpose. Her purpose was bigger than fear, bigger than prejudice, bigger than the danger that often followed her from place to place. There were nights when she could not find shelter and slept beneath the open sky, listening to the distant howl of wolves and the cold wind brushing across her face, nights when hunger twisted in her stomach, nights when her feet throbbed from endless walking, but she whispered to herself that she was not alone. She had never been alone. She was being guided step by something greater than the hardships surrounding her. And there were moments of tenderness too, moments when children ran to her with curiosity in their eyes, moments when mothers asked for her prayers, moments when newly freed families clung to her words as if they were lifelines pulling them toward a future they had never believed possible, moments when strangers placed warm bread in her hands and said, "Thank you for speaking truth, we needed you here." With every encounter, her courage deepened, her spirit expanded, her message sharpened like a blade forged in the fire of everything she had survived. And still the nation trembled. Debates over slavery raged louder, violence grew sharper, divisions spread deeper across the land. The country was becoming a battlefield of ideas, hearts torn between justice and oppression, faith and fear, progress and the chain of old habits. Sojourner walked straight into that conflict, not with weapons, not with armies, but with her voice, with her unwavering belief that truth could break chains, that truth could soften the hardest hearts, that truth could reshape the course of a nation drowning in its own cruelty. In the midst of this rising turmoil, she began to speak not only of freedom, but of the humanity and dignity of Black people newly freed or still in bondage, reminding audiences that emancipation was not the end of the fight. Liberation without respect was only another kind of prison. And she spoke to women, urging them to rise, urging them to demand what had long been denied, urging them to believe that their strength mattered, that their intellect mattered, that their humanity mattered, reminding them that they could change history if only they refused to remain silent. She showed the world that courage could wear the face of a woman, that truth could rise from the life of someone once enslaved, that a single voice could ignite a movement. But there was a new storm building on the horizon, the nation hurtling toward a war that would split families, destroy towns, and test the very soul of America, and Sojourner Truth could feel it approaching like a tremor beneath the ground. She did not fear it, she had lived through storms far worse. Instead, she prepared herself, knowing her role, knowing her destiny, knowing that even in the midst of war there would be suffering, there would be injustice, and there would be truth that needed speaking. The path ahead was uncertain, the tension rising across the country heavy enough to suffocate hope, but Sojourner kept walking step by step, guided by faith, guided by fire, guided by a purpose that had carried her from bondage into the heart of a revolution. And though she could not yet see the darkness that war would unleash, she also could not see the light she would bring into it, a light the nation desperately needed. Her journey was far from over. Her voice was only growing stronger. History was only beginning to understand her. The world was shaking now with the thunder of a nation tearing itself apart as the Civil War erupted across the land, cannons roaring through valleys, smoke crawling across fields, blood sinking into earth that had already known too much sorrow, and as soldiers marched toward battle with trembling hearts, Sojourner Truth felt the weight of the moment settle over her like a storm cloud pressing on her spirit, urging her to move, urging her to act. She had always believed her purpose was tied to freedom, and now freedom hung in the balance, more fragile than a whisper, more desperate than a prayer, the country fighting not only for its future, but for the souls of millions who had lived and died in chains. Sojourner stepped deeper into the heart of the struggle, not with weapons, not with violence, but with unwavering commitment, walking into camps filled with wounded soldiers, speaking comfort into trembling hands, praying over men who had not slept in weeks, singing softly to boys who feared the next sunrise would be their last. She moved through the makeshift hospitals where groans echoed against wooden walls, where surgeons worked by candlelight, where the smell of blood and smoke clung to the air, darkness heavy enough to suffocate hope, yet somehow her presence brought light, a soft, unbreakable glow that settled over the dying and the frightened, reminding them they were not alone. Some soldiers reached for her hand with tears in their eyes, calling her mother, calling her angel, calling her a reminder that hope could still exist even in a world collapsing around them. And in the chaos, Sojourner found another calling, one she had not expected, the fight to help freed slaves who had escaped the South, only to discover that freedom began not with celebration, but with struggle, families pouring into Union territory with nothing but the clothes on their backs, hunger in their bodies, and terror still clinging to their souls. She saw mothers who had carried their children through swamps and forests, fleeing the lash with nothing but faith guiding them. She saw fathers desperate to work, but turned away by those who refused to see them as fully human. She saw children thin and shivering, yet clinging to hope. Like a fragile flame they refused to let die. Sojourner stood before leaders and commanders demanding food, demanding shelter, demanding fair wages, demanding dignity for people who had been denied everything their entire lives. Some listened. Some resisted. But she kept pushing her truth into every door, every office, every stubborn heart, refusing to be ignored, refusing to let her people suffer any longer. When told that providing fair wages to freed men was unnecessary, she looked the official in the eye and said with a clarity that shook the room, "If they can shoulder muskets, they can shoulder pay." Her words traveled through the ranks like wildfire, bending attitudes, reshaping policies, reminding those in power that freedom meant nothing if it did not come with respect. Her courage carried her to Washington during the worst years of the war, where she met President Abraham Lincoln, a man whose decisions weighed heavily on the fate of millions, and when she stepped into his office, she carried herself not with fear, but with purpose, standing tall as she always had, speaking truth as she always did. Lincoln listened quietly to her words about justice and equality, about the wounds slavery had left on the nation, about the work that must be done not only to end bondage, but to rebuild the lives of those who had survived it, and though she did not know what would come of their meeting, she knew she had spoken truth to the highest seat of power in the land, and she knew truth had landed like a seed waiting to grow. After leaving the White House, she continued her mission across war-torn states, lifting spirits, fighting for protections, demanding fairness, and reminding every person she met that freedom was not just a proclamation, it was a promise, one that needed defending, one that needed nurturing, one that required the courage of those willing to speak even when the world refused to listen. The war raged on, and Sojourner kept moving, driven by something greater than exhaustion, greater than fear, greater than the grief she witnessed each day, her feet carrying her through mud, through rain, through cold nights, when the wind howled across the land like a mourning cry. And then one morning the sound of gunfire faded into an unfamiliar silence, the news spreading quickly through towns and camps and crowded streets. The war was ending. Slavery would be abolished. Freedom had finally broken through the darkness like a sunrise after the longest night. People celebrated, cried, fell to their knees, embraced one another with trembling joy, but Sojourner Truth did not pause to rest. She looked at the horizon and saw the next battle rising, waiting, calling, because emancipation was only the first step, and the road to equality was long and steep and filled with shadows still lingering in the corners of the nation. She whispered to herself the same quiet truth she had carried since the day she walked away from bondage. There is more work to do. And so the years moved forward like a river, carrying the echoes of every footstep Sojourner Truth had taken, and though her hair grew silver and her hands grew thin, her voice never softened, for she knew that the world still needed its firekeepers, souls brave enough to guard the flame of justice and pass it onward. She traveled across towns and cities, riding in creaking wagons, walking down dusty roads, standing on wooden stages in cold halls where the air smelled of damp timber and sweat, and she spoke with the same thunder she had carried all her life, and the people who heard her felt something rise within themselves, something ancient, something undeniable, something true. There were whispers in the streets that the war was nearing its end, that chains were weakening, that hearts were changing, and she felt the weight of every enslaved man, woman, and child pressing against her spirit, urging her to keep going just a little longer. She visited freedmen camps, where newly liberated families huddled around fire pits, warming their hands and their hopes, and when she walked among them they stared with wide shining eyes as if witnessing a miracle, and she saw in their faces not the sorrow of what had been, but the dawning light of what could be. She sang to them in trembling hymn songs older than memory, carrying stories of bondage and resilience, and every verse wrapped the people in a feeling that perhaps tomorrow truly could be different, and children clung to her skirt, women held her hands, men bowed their heads, and together they breathed in a new kind of air, the air of possibility. When the Emancipation Proclamation echoed through the land, she did not shout, she did not weep, she simply closed her eyes and let a deep breath fill her lungs as if she were inhaling the very beginning of a new world, and then she whispered a prayer for all those who had not lived to see this moment, a prayer carried by the wind like a soft lament. But freedom was not the finish line, and she knew it, so she marched straight into the next battle, the fight for true equality, for land, for dignity, for humanity. And she met presidents, she confronted generals, she spoke to rooms filled with men who underestimated her, and yet every time she stood tall and stared into their eyes with the unshakable certainty of a mountain and forced them to hear her truth. She fought for the rights of Black soldiers, demanding that they be treated with respect, honored for their service, compensated for their labor, and her voice moved through the halls of government like a force of nature, unrelenting, unstoppable. She championed women's rights with a fire that startled even seasoned activists, reminding them that the fight for justice must never leave anyone behind, and when she spoke, crowds would lean forward as if drawn by a gravitational pull created by her courage and her conviction. Even as her body aged, her presence grew only more powerful, and people traveled miles just to hear her speak, to touch her hand, to stand in the shadow of a woman who had risen from chains to become a living monument to resilience. Her final years unfolded like the closing chapters of an epic tale: gentle sunsets, warm evenings, the rustle of leaves outside her window, the quietude of a life that had been spent entirely in service of others, and sometimes when visitors came to see her she would smile with that knowing tenderness and say, "I have done a great work, and there is still more to be done, but the Lord will send others." And when the day came that her breath finally stilled, the earth seemed to pause, the wind held itself, the sky dimmed as if mourning the passing of a soul carved from pure courage, and people across the nation felt the tremor of her departure. Yet she had not gone, not truly, for her legacy lingered in every courtroom where justice was demanded, in every protest where voices rose in unity, in every woman who spoke boldly, in every Black child who dared to dream, in every place where truth was needed and someone stepped forward to deliver it. Sojourner Truth lived on in the courage she had ignited, like sparks carried across generations, lighting fires she would never see, but had always believed would one day blaze. Her story was not just a tale of an extraordinary woman, but a reminder that one voice can move mountains, that one life can reshape history, that the truth, when spoken with bravery, can echo forever. And even now, if you listen closely, you can feel her words stirring in the marrow of the world, whispering, "Rise, speak, stand, be unafraid." Because the truth is alive, and she is still here. She walked through the years of her life as if the earth itself remembered every footprint she had ever placed upon it, a quiet rhythm moving with her wherever she went, a rhythm that whispered of fields she once worked, of nights she once feared, and of mornings where she dared to rise again even when the world insisted she should remain quiet and unseen. Sojourner moved from town to town, carrying not just her story, but the weight of countless other stories pressed into her palms like fragile offerings, each one belonging to someone who had been silenced, someone who had been beaten, someone who had been told that the sky was not theirs to look upon freely. And as she carried those stories, they began to gather around her like invisible companions, urging her to keep walking, urging her to keep speaking, urging her to never allow truth to fade. Crowds continued to form whenever she stepped forward, her voice rising not in anger, but in a kind of vast trembling power that came from a place deeper than sorrow and older than fear. People felt it in their bones before they understood it with their minds. They felt something shift, something echo, something awaken, as if a sleeping part of their own spirit had been called back into the body. There were moments when she paused at the edge of a gathering and wondered how a woman born into bondage could stand here now, guiding others with a voice that no longer shook with uncertainty. Moments when she looked inward and felt the old wounds pressing gently against her ribs, the past never vanishing but no longer able to claim her. Her words moved like rivers across the country, carrying truth through valleys and over hills, reaching farms and cities alike, until even those who had never heard the stories directly found themselves repeating phrases they could not forget, phrases born from her courage, from her endurance, from the unbreakable fire she carried. And on a quiet evening, as the sun bent low against the horizon, painting the sky with a soft gold, she found herself standing beneath a tree older than any memory she possessed, feeling the wind brush her face like a familiar hand. She closed her eyes, not to retreat from the world, but to hear it more clearly than ever before, the hum of the earth, the pulse of life, the whisper of liberation that still had miles to travel. She thought of all the women who had been denied their voices, all the children who had been denied safety, all the men and women who had walked with chains that the world pretended not to see, and she felt an ache inside her that was not sadness, but a promise that she would not allow their truth to disappear. Whenever she returned to a place she had once spoken, she was met with faces that had been changed by her message. Eyes brighter, shoulders squared, breath steadier, souls somehow stronger. They approached her with letters, with tears, with trembling hands, thanking her for a strength they believed she had given them, though she knew the strength had always been their own, waiting to be remembered. She lived long enough to watch her own name become something larger than she ever imagined, not an echo of pain, but a beacon, a guidepost, a living testament that one woman armed with nothing but truth could bend the course of history without lifting anything but her voice. And when her final days arrived, she did not fade. She glowed, her life gathering around her like a tapestry woven from every step she had taken, every story she had spoken, every chain she had shattered with words that refused to be softened. She rested knowing that the world had changed because she insisted on telling the truth, not loudly, but clearly, not violently, but powerfully, not perfectly, but bravely. Her passing was gentle, like a sigh carried across a field, her spirit rising the way dawn rises, slow, steady, beautiful, inevitable, and the people who had loved her, who had learned from her, who had been reshaped by her, gathered to speak of the woman who had turned her suffering into a force that generations would follow long after her footsteps faded. They spoke of her courage, but her courage had been born from survival. They spoke of her wisdom, but her wisdom had been carved from wounds. They spoke of her power, but her power had been drawn from a truth larger than any single life. And in the telling of her story, a new generation began to rise, ready to carry the fire she left behind. Her legacy became a living flame passed from heart to heart across decades and centuries, lighting the path for those walking toward justice, for those refusing silence, for those choosing to rise again and again, even when rising hurt. And so her spirit walks still, through classrooms and protests, through quiet libraries and crowded halls, through stories whispered to children at night. Her presence felt not in marble statues or dusty pages, but in every act of bravery born from truth, in every voice that refuses to be dimmed, in every woman who steps forward claiming her rightful place beneath the open sky. Sojourner Truth stands as more than a memory. She stands as a summons, a call to rise, a reminder that the world changes not only through power or wealth, but through the courageous insistence of a single soul who speaks the truth when silence is safest. Her footsteps whisper across time, urging each of us to carry what she carried, to speak what she spoke, to see what she saw, that justice is not distant, that freedom is not abstract, that dignity is not optional, that truth, no matter how fragile, no matter how quiet, can carve a road where there was once only darkness and lead all of us toward a dawn we have yet to witness, but are destined to reach. This is where her journey becomes ours, where her voice becomes a seed planted in the soil of every listening heart, where her courage becomes a spark capable of setting the world alight once more, where her truth becomes a living inheritance passed from generation to generation, whispering, rise, rise, rise.